What's up, everybody? Garrett Rummel here with Duty to Train. I wanted to go over the last video that we did. John Stewart was talking about a well-regulated militia, and I want to look up what exactly well-regulated meant back in the day when the people wrote Second Amendment. Because in order to figure out what they meant, the term that everyone is stuck on is well-regulated. What does that mean, right? Because a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, right? So the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed because you need to have a free state. In order to do that, you need to have a well-regulated militia. What does a well-regulated militia mean? Let's figure that out. Okay. So we are going to share our screen, but first we need to open some internets. Whoopsie. Here we go. Okay. All right, this one might be a little bit longer. I am not going to cut this off. This one might be the longest one ever. If it takes 2 hours, it takes 2 hours. I want to figure out what well-regulated means. And when anyone ever says, well, that's not what it means, I'll be able to say, go look at my 2-hour video. That's exactly what it means. So what did well-regulated mean in 1791? Mises. Okay, first one. All right, this is from 2018, Mises Institute. I don't even know what that is. So we can't ignore the militia clause of the Second Amendment. Okay, I'm going to get comfortable because this could take a while. All right, well, many defenders of private gun ownership recognize that the Second Amendment was written to provide, get out of here, some sort of counterbalance against the coercive power of the state. This argument is often left far too vague to reflect an accurate view of this historical context surrounding the amendment. After all, it is frequently pointed out that the private ownership of shotguns and semi-automatic rifles could offer only very limited resistance to the extremely well-equipped and well-armed United States military. Okay, true, but look at what Afghanistan was able to do to Russia in the 1980s, and then to the American government, the strongest military ever known to humankind. We were thwarted by a bunch of dudes in the sand with ARs and some IEDs, some homemade IEDs. So I don't agree with that. I don't know. After all, it is frequently pointed out, I guess they're not saying this, they're just saying it is frequently pointed out that private ownership of shotguns and semi-automatic rifles could offer only very limited resistance. I have never heard someone argue that the private ownership of shotguns really helps you fight back against a tyrannical government. However, an AR definitely helps you, just like an AK. An AK and an AR, for all intents and purposes, are synonymous with each other when it comes to their ability to fight back against a tyrannical government, right? They have high capacity magazines, high rates of fire. They're accurate out to fairly far ranges. And AKs aren't as accurate. Like AKs are better at out to 300 yards or so. ARs can be a little bit more out to 500 or so. But if you are a militia type movement, like what Afghanistan did to us, they weren't taking pop shots at us for the most part from 500 yards out, right? They would take some shots and then scurry away, in towns and stuff like that. So anyway, kind of beside the point. It is often, therefore, just assumed that the writers of the Second Amendment were naive and incapable of seeing the vast asymmetries that would develop between military weaponry and the sort of weaponry the average person was likely to use. Was the plan really to just have, okay, let's try to get through this fast because I'm not gonna be able to read everything all the time. Okay, so the answer is, okay, was the plan really to just have unorganized amateurs grab their rifles and repel the invasion of a well-trained military force? The answer is no. And we know this by looking at the wording and reasoning behind the Second Amendment. The text, of course, reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I'm a little bit sick, so if you hear my nasal issue, that's why. Gun rights advocates often fixate on the second half of the amendment, claiming that the phrase about a militia is just something that provides a reasoning for the second phrase. Many opponents of gun control even suggest that the only phrase here of key importance is "shall not be infringed." Second Amendment as a guard against a standing army. Looking at the debates surrounding the Second Amendment and military power at the end of the, I have to say, I really like the wording. I don't know. I've never heard of Mises, whatever. I just like the way that this is being worded. It seems to be at least attempting to be objective, I guess you could say. Gun rights advocates shall not be infringed. The Second Amendment is a guard against a standing army. Looking at the debates surrounding the Second Amendment and military power at the end of the 18th century, however, we find that the authors of the Second Amendment had a more sophisticated vision of gun ownership than is often assumed. Fearful that a large federal military could be used to destroy the freedoms of the states themselves, anti-federalists and other Americans fearful of centralized power in the U.S. government designed the Second Amendment accordingly. It was designed to guarantee that the states would be free to raise and train their own militias as a defense against federal power and as a means of keeping a defensive military force available to Americans while remaining outside the direct control of the federal government. This grew out of what was well-established opposition to standing armies among Americans in the late 18th century. In his book, Eagle and Sword, The Federalists and the Creation of the Military Establishment in America, 1783-1802, Richard Cohen writes, no principle of government was more widely understood or more completely accepted by the generation of Americans that established the United States than the danger of a standing army in peacetime. Because a standing army represented the ultimate and uncontrolled and controllable power, any nation that maintained permanent forces surely risked the overthrow of legitimate government and the introduction of tyranny and despotism. We can see this plainly in the speeches and writings of the anti-federalists like Patrick Henry, but we also see it in the more moderate attendees of the Constitutional Convention, as well as George Mason, who, when once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. Okay, so I'm just we can see this plainly in the speeches and writings of the anti-federalists. My history on stuff like this is not great. I'm sure I'm going to learn more about this as we go, but I'm not sure what the anti-federalists were. I guess maybe they were even smaller government, like they wanted to like really decentralize the government. Patrick Henry, but we also see it in the more moderate attendees. So I guess that kind of makes it sound like there were also people who were maybe on the other side of this argument who were involved in writing the Second Amendment. So there were some people who were advocating for this, but this makes it sound like there were some people who were advocating for the opposite, possibly. Sentiments like Mason's did not represent the views of oddball outliers. Okay. Maybe that contradicts what I just said. Hopefully they give us some, they gave us one thing that somebody said about it, but I would hope that when once a standing army is established in any country, the people lose their liberty. Okay. Sometimes like Mason, okay, how to combat the power of a federal standing army? On this, the Americans did not need to reinvent the wheel. After all, the idea of locally controlled military forces answerable to civil officials was put into place in 17th century England. English militias had been created out of fear of a large standing army directly answerable to the king. Although, okay. Okay, although the system had fallen into disuse in England. Okay, so let's read that one more time. But how to combat the power of a federal standing army? On this, the Americans did not need to reinvent the wheel because this had been done before. After all, the idea of locally controlled military forces answerable to civil officials was put into place in 17th century England. Okay, we're going to open this up and see. Okay. Oh my God, to repel slave. Okay, this goes into something else. The creation of militias and the English Civil War. Okay, so we have to take this one step at a time. I don't want to get back into the weeds. I need to be more focused when I come to this and not get too much into the weeds. Although the system had fallen into disuse in England by the time the Americans were debating. Okay, so the English militias had been created out of fear of a large standing army directly answerable to the king. Although the system had fallen into disuse in England by the time the Americans were debating the matter in the 18th century, the Americans were well aware of this history. Okay, so they didn't come up with the idea of standalone militias to fight back against a tyrannical, large standing army. This had already been put into place in the 17th century England. These ideas were further developed at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, where Patrick Henry mocked the idea that liberties could be preserved by simply assembling the people. Without locally controlled military might, Henry noted, federal force could destroy the independence of the state governments. That makes sense, right? That makes sense. Similarly, George Mason concluded that the militia ... is our ultimate safety. I wonder what he said in between ... and is our ultimate safety. We can have no security without it. I don't like when people do things like that. And then like, I don't know, I don't like the ... dots. Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to see what he did or what he said. At University of Chicago, debate in Virginia ratifying convention. So let's look up here. Okay, my honorable friend attacked the honorable gentleman with universal principles that... Okay, the militia, sir, is our ultimate safety. We can have no security without it. Okay, so it seems to be a pretty accurate description. Rulers have been actuated by motives of individual interest and private emoluments, and that in America it would be so also. I hope before we part with this great bulwark, this noble palladium of safety, we shall have such... Can you imagine if we talked like this? Ooh, man, we'd be so much smarter. We shall have such checks interposed as will render us secure. Dude, I can't even understand this. The militia, sir, is our ultimate safety. We can have no security without it. That seems to be pretty clear. But then he says that the power of arming and organizing the militia is concurrent and to be equally exercised by the general and state governments. Okay. But then he says that the power of arming and organizing the militia is concurrent and to be equally exercised by the general and state governments. Okay, so that makes it, again, this is why I'm doing this, so people can see, so you can like tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like right here. But then he says that the power of arming and organizing the militia is concurrent and to be equally exercised by the general and state governments. So you have the militia is our ultimate safety. We can't have any security without it. But the power of arming and organizing the militia is to be equally exercised by the general and state government. So the people are allowed to have their weapons, and the general and state governments are allowed to have their weapons. And then that way, if anything ever happens, I am sure and I trust in the candor of that gentleman that he will recede from that opinion when his recollection will be called to that particular clause which relates to it. Okay, all right. So I just wanted to make sure that that was not being misconstrued, which it does not. So I'm just, when you look at this, I just want to make sure that as we're reading through things like that, if they do give us quotes, I want to make sure that they're accurate and they're not being distorted. Because if they took that quote out of context right here, if they took this quote out of context, then I would say, that kind of puts the entire article in doubt, right? If you're willing to misquote somebody to make your point, that I can't really trust what you have to say. But that all they took out was militia, my good sir, is our ultimate safety. Okay, as historian Leon Friedman concludes, the people organized in the state militias were regarded as a counterforce against the threat that the regular army could be. used as an instrument of oppression and service in the militia was okay. Sorry, the militia or the people organized in the state militias were regarded as a counterforce against the threat that the regular army could be used as an instrument of oppression, and service in the militia was a right of the citizen that could not be transgressed by the federal government. Okay. All right. In light of this, it's easier to see the key element offered by the militia phrase of the Second Amendment. Even after the adoption of the new Constitution, opposition to a powerful federal military continued. Congress opposed not only attempts, the unorganized militia and private gun ownership. As Brian McClanahan has shown, the Second Amendment, like the First Amendment, was never written to apply to the states themselves, but to Congress. I have heard something like this. If you never heard this argument before, let's see. First Amendment provides that Congress make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting its free exercise. It protects freedom of speech. So I have heard the argument that all this is talking about is that Congress should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting its free exercise. And the argument I have heard goes a little something like this. Basically, you have the big federal government, right? And if you want to have a constitutional republic and it's not all dominated by this one federal government, these like state governments can control what people can and can't do more so than the federal government can, because you can see what happened 250 years later. Now we have like, do we have guns nationwide? Do we have abortion nationwide? Do we have all of these things like nationwide? And when it comes into like all this gender theory stuff, there's a lot of places that are like, hey, we don't want that. There's other places that say, hey, we do want that. And now that's like, I'm getting like way into the weeds. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just saying that if you've never heard this argument before, the general idea is that the federal government can't do this. That's why it says it provides that. It doesn't say that government, it specifically says Congress right here, right? That Congress make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And I guess, maybe you could say that state Congress, state governments can't do that, but it specifically says Congress. So anyway, I just want to let you know that that's kind of where that's coming from. The Second Amendment, like the first, was never written to apply to the states themselves, but to Congress. That's where it gets it from. Like the First Amendment, where it says Congress shall make no law. The states were still free to regulate the ownership of weaponry. Okay, the states were still okay. Interesting. Okay, the states were okay, and the reason that people interpret it this way, and I have only really heard conservatives interpret it this way, is because if you say that everybody gets abortion, right, then it's like a huge fight. But if it's like, okay, if you want abortion, go live in California. If you don't want to have abortion, go live in Florida. Then it's like, okay, then we can kind of all live in the same country. We're not fighting each other, because it's like, okay, if you want those certain rights, go live there. If you want these other certain rights, come live here. And that allows us to live in harmony without like ripping each other's throats out, because we want other people to live like us. It allows us to live differently, but together. The states were still free to regulate the ownership of weaponry in their own constitutions and by their own legislatures. Most state governments, however, elected to include provisions in their own constitutions protecting private gun ownership as an element of the state's overall militia strategy. Okay. I guess the only thing that I would say, though, is that, as Brian McClanahan has shown, the Second Amendment, like the First Amendment, was never written to apply to states themselves, but to Congress. Let's just look up, like, I don't know, I guess I would, Bill of Rights. First 10 minutes. Okay. Amendment 3, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house. The right of the people to secure in their possessions, houses, papers, and against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. I guess you have like no-knock warrants, right? But that's still a warrant, right? So it seems like no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of grand jury. Like, is this up to the states, right? Like if article or if Amendment 2 is supposed to be interpreted as Amendment 1, then wouldn't it stand to reason that all the rest of them would be interpreted the same way? So all of these rights are basically up to the opinion of the states, but it seems like Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. I guess, I don't know. My personal, again, this is just, I want to be honest about like what I'm thinking as I'm going through this, so people can like pick apart my argument if they have an issue, is one, the founders were smart enough, like if they wanted to say Congress in all the amendments, would they have not just said Congress in all the amendments? You know, maybe at the time, if you say, you know, maybe at the time, you know, in the at the time that it was written, the norm was to write like one thing in the beginning and then it pertained to everything else, but that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I'm just trying to give them the benefit of the doubt here. But anyway, let's continue. The states were still free to regulate. Okay, this is understandable given the long tradition of the unorganized militia in American history. While some advocates of gun control might claim that gun ownership is guaranteed only to those engaged in active militia service, which is what we've gone over previously in other videos, this idea is directly opposed by the provision in state constitutions guaranteeing private gun ownership and a general inclusion in the militia of all able-bodied males. Okay, let's read that one more time. This idea is directly opposed by the provisions in state constitutions guaranteeing private gun ownership. That makes a lot of sense. And a general inclusion in the militia of all able-bodied males. Okay, so this is saying that while some advocates of gun control might claim that gun ownership is guaranteed only to those engaged in active militia service, this idea is directly opposed by a general inclusion. So I'm just skipping to make it easy. I'm skipping all that, but by skipping all of that is directly opposed by, and taking out the and, opposed by a general inclusion in the militia of all able-bodied males. Because if you're going to create a militia, what is a militia created by? Like, who is it made up of? And back in the day, it wasn't a bunch of women. It was a bunch of guys. And so that's what it's trying to say. Is that the militia isn't formed until the militia is formed. But if the militia can't be formed because all of the people that would have formed it don't have guns, then you don't really have a militia. And maybe that was poorly worded, but a militia is made up of a bunch of people like myself, right? Able-bodied, gun-bearing Americans, right? If you take away my guns, I no longer have the ability to form a militia with other able-bodied men because we have all gotten our guns taken away. Now, again, I seem, biased here, but that makes sense. A well-regulated militia. What I am trying to figure out in this video is when Colin Noir, and he was going after John Stewart saying well-regulated, he was saying well-regulated meant like well-maintained. That's what I'm trying to figure out. And I just don't want to skip over things, but that's what I'm trying to figure out. What did they mean when they wrote well-regulated? So maybe let's just try to like skip ahead and try to find that. This notion was recognized by policymakers even before ratification. In practice, founding era militias were far from universal, but in the founders' conceptual framework, the militia consisted of a mass of ordinary citizens trained to arms and available to serve at the call of the state. As George Mason put it, who are the militia? They consist, okay, he keeps using George Mason, which is totally fine. I would just like to see a couple of different people use, so we're not just counting on one person, right? Because like Nowadays, you could take some like far right people and then 100 years from now be like, this person said this and they were conservative. It's like, yeah, technically they were conservative, but they were super far right, right? Who would be like super far right nowadays? I don't like listen to a whole lot of like super far right people. I could go far left, like AOC is pretty far left. I was actually, I think like Capitol Hill. I was actually just talking to a cousin of mine who lives in Seattle, and I was asking him, is Seattle as bad to live in as like the news says? And he says, he said he's like, I lived there for like 6 years. Where they did the CHOP thing, where like you couldn't go in, the representative out of that county or that district apparently is like way bonkers, he said. And he's not like a conservative at all. And he's like, yeah, she's got some crazy ideas, but apparently people in that district are on board. But he's like, yeah, nothing that she wants to do would ever get implemented. And so, anyway, my point of saying this is that he keeps saying George Mason. I just want to make sure that he's not just cherry picking one person who likes his opinion to write this entire article about. Because if someone 100 years from now wanted to rewrite history and say, oh, this one woman who was in charge of this one Seattle district, and George Mason was, I believe, obviously George Mason. Yeah, founding father. Why is George Mason a founding father? Renowned for his authorship of the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Virginia Bill of Rights and Constitution, George Mason became an advocate for the rights of colonists by the 1760s and flourished through the 1770s. Founding father, a leader of the Virginia Patriots on the eve of the American Revolution, Mason served on the Committee of Safety, and in 1776, okay, George Mason died 1792, born 1725, American patriot and statesman who insisted on the protection of individual liberties and the composition of both the Virginia and U.S. Constitution. He was ahead of his time in opposing slavery and in rejecting the constitutional compromise that perpetuated it. As a landowner and near neighbor of George Washington, Mason took a leading part in local affairs. He also became deeply interested in Western expansion and was active in the Ohio Company. Mason served on the Committee of Safety. Mason's work was known to Thomas Jefferson and influenced his drafting of the Declaration of Independence. This is according to Britannica. The model was soon followed by most of the states and was also incorporated as a member of the Constitutional Convention. Okay, all right. So he was like a legit founding father. Okay, I wanted to make sure that he wasn't just like someone who influenced the founding fathers. Mason strenuously opposed the compromise permitting the Constitution or continuation of the slave trade until 1808. Although he was a Southerner, Mason castigated the trade as disgraceful to mankind. Okay. All right, let's continue. All right. Anyway, my point is, I just hope that he uses some other people because I would like to be able to quote a slew of different founding fathers on all of their opinions, not just take one person's opinion. By the close of the 19th century, this sort of language would be commonplace. In 1894, a collection of texts from constitutions shows that not fewer than 22 state constitutions contain language along the lines of the militia of the state shall consist of all able-bodied male residents of the state between the ages of 18 and 45 years. To ensure a ready availability of men used to handling firearms, these constitutional provisions are often accompanied by state guarantees of a right to keep and bear arms, similar to the 1780 Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, which states the people have a right to keep and bear arms for the common defense, and as in times of peace, armies are dangerous to liberty. They ought not to be maintained without the consent of the legislature, and the military power shall always be held in exact subordination to the civil authority and be governed by it. Okay. Okay, it's just going over different, as noted by Jeffrey Rogers Hummel, many states experimented with various measures designed to increase the training and readiness of this militia. The founders did, okay. Clearly, this stands in contrast to the idea of today's National Guard. According to Yaski, the founders did have a concept that approximates today's National Guard, but it was a concept they disapproved. This is the select militia, especially, okay. This isn't giving us a whole, I'm just gonna, all right. Sorry to go through all of that and then dip out, but this is part of the research. What was that, Glock 19? What is that? I don't know. All right. Gun policy is among the most, okay. Well, that's just fantastic. Look at this article. It's among the most controversial topics. What can or should we do about it? Enact more restrictions? Other mindful of the government's failure to protect people? America on trial? Okay, so maybe this just gives you a feature. The Second Amendment, opportunities and threats. Okay, so this seems like it might just be, oh, okay, so this is just gun control, and it gives you a bunch of Second Amendment ruling is about self-defense. Oh, this is all by Stephen P. Hallbrook. I wonder, okay, Second Amendment, opportunities and threats. Long march to restore the Second Amendment in New York. Okay, this is all written by like one or two guys, so let's try and find CNN politics. Okay, this is good. All right, so this CNN, I don't think is super friendly to the Second Amendment to the extreme. I would argue they're not friendly at all, but let's just, I like these because I think that this allows us to really kind of pick apart, and if it stands on its merits, then it stands on its merits. But let's see what they have to say. CNN, it's only sentence long, 27 words that barely take up a full line on the Bill of Rights. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And yet, for years, those 27 brief words have been the source of contentious debate, seen by some as an inalienable protection against tyranny, by others as a dangerous anachronism. Here's a look at the Second Amendment, its phrases parsed and placed in legal and historical context. This came out in 2016. Our guides will be constitutional experts Jeffrey Rosen and Jack Rekove. See, all right, fair enough. I'm dubious of CNN giving the Second Amendment its due, but let's see what these constitutional experts have to say. Now you can tell I'm super dubious of CNN, but I think with good reason. What is a militia? At the time of the American Revolutionary War, militias were groups of able-bodied men who protected their towns, colonies, and eventually states. When the Constitution was drafted, the militia was a state-based institution, says Rekove. States were responsible for organizing this. When the Constitution was drafted, the militia was a state-based institution. Okay. States were responsible for organizing this. I mean, they might be responsible for organizing it as in the same way as, if we didn't have a standing army or we didn't have anything, right? And then we got attacked as America today, right? Who would be responsible for organizing the militia, right? Like the state, they'd probably like send people out and be like, hey, we need you to come and fight. We need you to come and fight. I don't think from what we've read that it really seems like the states were responsible for organizing it as being like completely in control of it. So that's, again, this is like, you have to start parsing this right away. States were responsible for organizing this. What does organizing mean? Does it mean organizing as in, hey, everybody, we need you to come and fight? Or does it mean, okay, you're the only people that are allowed to have guns. Everybody else, you're not allowed to have guns. I think the former. One of the biggest challenge. Okay, what did it mean to be well regulated? One of the biggest challenges in interpreting a centuries-old document is that the meanings of words change or diverge. Well-regulated in 18th century tended to be something like well-organized, well-armed, well-disciplined. says Rakov. It didn't mean regulation in the sense that we use it now, in that it's not about the regulatory state. There's been nuance there. It means the militia was in an effective shape to fight. Okay, that's exactly what Colin Noir said. So, all right, let's go. I'm not going to do like every single thing, but when I find like a really good, I think this is going to be July 22nd. What does well regulated mean? Oh Lord. Okay. Um Now, am I filling this in because I like it? Yeah, you bet. But this is the second person and the only person I've heard that has said, this is what this person's saying. Constitution. Okay, all right. Constitution Center. Okay. So now we have well-regulated in the 18th century. Okay. And remember the firearm homicide rate. Okay. So I just want to make sure that we're like nailing down all the really important points that we come across on both sides. Like if I see one that's like, hey, like knock down cold, this is not what it means. Then we'll do that as well. In other words, it didn't mean the state was controlling the militia in a certain way, but rather that the militia was prepared to do its duty. Okay, so John Stewart. I want to take a look at this and not just take, just do a little bit of research, John Stewart, a little bit of research. What type of security was referred to here? To get to that, consider the climate of the United States at the time. The country had just fought a war, won its independence, and was expanding west. There were plenty of reasons to feel unsafe, and so security had a very palpable meaning. You have an expanding country, and the principal defense use of the militia would be to protect local residents from attack and invasion, Rakov says. It also meant physical protection from government overreach. The idea of a state militia would also be attractive because it serves as a deterrent against national tyranny. All right, this sounds pretty. I'm rather surprised, says Rakov. At the time, if government forces tried to take over land or overstep their boundaries, you'd have an institution in place. The militia that would outnumber any army. Yes, yes, and yes. Right? I know I'm not like super unbiased, but like the arguments for the Second Amendment, like I just think that they just make sense. This is why I've listened to lots of arguments. I've just never done my own research, but this is why I've like fallen strongly on the side of the Second Amendment. Because every time I hear this, at the time, listen to this. At the time, if the government forces tried to take over land or overstep their boundaries, you'd have an institution in place, the militia, that would outnumber any army. Right? Yes, we have a third of Americans, which is roughly 100 million people, own 450 million guns in America. Wow. Like, good luck trying to take us over. It's one of the things that makes me so happy when it comes to our rights. Like, there has never been a more armed populace than the United States. It's wild. If you think that the United States military can unleash some hell, and it can, like when it comes to bombing, but what the Afghani people how they were able to push back America and Russia. I mean, good luck to anyone trying to invade America. Like, dude, 100 million people, 100 million people with 450 million guns, door to door. I mean, that would be impossible. That would be a nightmare. Okay, anyway. Of course, with the size and scope of the modern United States military and the fact that militias, as we know it no longer exist, that notion is hard to imagine today. True. In the debate over the Second Amendment, this phrase, a well-regulated militia, remains one of the most cited and argued parts of the sentence. What did a free state mean? It may seem obvious, but Rosen and Revoke agree the Constitution bore a lot of contemporary moralism, and not every word is well defined. In this case, the meaning of state is what it appears to be. Well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. This is referring immediately to state, as in one of the states of the original colonies, Rosen says. James Madison had the 1777 Virginia Declaration of Rights by his side when he wrote the Bill of Rights, and he essentially copied and pasted language from it. Interesting. Let's open this. And I am just like going off. Okay. Interesting. Excerpt from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, 1777. That a well-regulated militia or composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state, that standing armies in times of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. Okay, so that's where it says that a well-regulated militia. So that's, yeah, interesting. So it comes directly, or composed of the body of the people trained to arms. Okay, so he took it from the Virginia Declaration of Rights from 1777. Or composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. So being necessary to the defense of a free state. Interesting. Okay. All right, let's continue. I think that's a pretty good one to just copy down real quick. La 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 la. Insert link from fly. Okay. Now we go back here. Let's keep on going. The language here clearly informed the language of the Second Amendment, but it could also speak to a larger understanding of liberty. So here, Rosen continues, George Mason, the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, is talking about not only the free state of Virginia, he is also talking about a broader state of freedom. What kind of rights? This is another highly contested area where it helps to know more about the framers of the Constitution, thought about complex ideas like rights. When we think about rights, we think of them as regulations and exemptions, Rakove says. But at the birth of our nation, they had a different quality. They were more moralistic. Rosen says this viewpoint is reflected in the Declaration of Independence. Interesting. Okay. They were more moralistic. Like, okay, so we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Like, that's not really a right? It's just, it governs like entire aspects of American law. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Like, are those all rights? Like, do you have the right to life? Yes. Liberty? Yes. Pursuit of happiness? Yes. But those aren't like super specific, I guess is what he's trying to say. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving that they're just powers from the consent of the governed. Interesting. Super, super interesting. Okay, the framers definitely believed in natural rights, that they are endowed by a creator, Rosen says. They believed we are born into a state of nature before we form governments, and that we are endowed with certain fundamental rights. These natural rights include the rights of religious expression, free speech, property, and more, but they did not, Rosen says, specifically include the tenets of the Second Amendment. The framers did not talk about the right to bear arms as one of the set of natural rights, he says, but it is fair to say that the right to alter and abolish government to the degree that modern people claim they have that right, the framers certainly believe it. In that sense, it is historically accurate to say that the framers did recognize a natural right of self-defense. Interesting. Well, CNN is surprising. Even the term people, the most basic catch-all has limitations. You say people, you mean individual persons, says Revoke. But if you go to Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, it says the House of Representatives will be chosen by the people, who are the persons who are entitled to exercise that suffrage. You see, you can use the term people to imply a collective mass, but there are some categories of people that can be excluded. After all, when the Constitution was written, slaves were considered property and women were not allowed to vote. In addition, there's a more basic question of semantics. By the people, is the Second Amendment referring to people as private entities or as participants in the militia? Okay, gotcha. I see where they're going with this. Okay, the right of the people to keep. Okay, the legal consensus is the Second Amendment applies to individual rights within reasonable regulations. More on that below. Yeah. What are arms in this context, and what is the scope of bearing arms? In the District of Columbia v. Heller, the Supreme Court decided the rights outlined by the Second Amendment did apply specifically to possession of firearms for purposes of self-defense. The decision struck down the Firearms Control Regulations Act of 1975, which heavily regulated owning and keeping firearms in the District of Columbia. In the above excerpt, we can see the court considered the awkward phrasing of the amendment. The justices divided the amendment into an operative clause, right of the people to keep and bear arms, and a prefatory clause, a well-regulated militia being necessary to carry a free state. The court determined the relationship between these phrases, as well as the historical context of the Constitution's creation, clearly provided an individual right. The term arms is also an ever-changing one, and there are ongoing debates about assault weapons and emerging firearm technologies. Okay, assault weapons is a misnomer. It stands for Armalite rifle. I use it in my videos because it does make it clear what we're actually talking about. But maybe I need to stop doing that and just call them semi-automatic rifles because I am contributing to the problem. One thing people disagree about is whether assault weapons, misnomer, Armalite rifle, semi-automatic weapons, bans are constitutional, says Rosen. They also disagree about how we should interpret the Constitution in terms of history or in light of new technologies. What does it all mean? Okay, for modern applications and purposes, Rosen agrees that we must turn to how the Second Amendment is presented in a court of law. For the most part, these applications have remained consistent since the Heller decision in 2008, and a similar case, McDonald v. City of Chicago, which was decided in 2010. It's really striking that since these Supreme Court decisions, lower courts have upheld almost all of the gun regulations they've asked to review, he says. Rakove thinks the framers of the Constitution would be surprised at the conversations we are having today. While there's a common law right to self-defense, most historians think that it would be remarkable news to the framers of the Second Amendment that they were actually constitutionalizing a personal right to self-defense as opposed to trying to say something significant about the militia, he says. Words like militia and rights are loaded with historical context and nuance that can act as a Rorschach test, leading even the best intentioned interpreters to different conclusions. If there were any clear answers, these 27 words wouldn't be so incendiary. Maybe it's just me, but that ending like totally surprised me. It seems like they were like, yeah, no, it's all like super pro Second Amendment. And then at the end, it's like, while there is common law rights to self-defense, most historians think it would be remarkable news to the framers of the Second Amendment that they were actually constitutionally a personal right to self-defense, as opposed to trying to say something significant about the militia. Okay, even if say like give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's right, is there a difference? Right? Does it matter what you're talking about here? Constitutionalizing a personal right to self-defense is the same thing as being able to form a militia. I guess the one difference there, I'm just talking about that specific point that he's making. He's saying that the framers of the Second Amendment, the founding fathers, find it remarkable news to realize that they were actually constitutionalizing a personal right to self-defense as opposed to trying to say something significant about the militia. But what if they were trying to do both? So, yeah, okay. Well, I find this like odd because it seemed like they were like, I don't know, they were falling on the pro Second Amendment side, and then all of a sudden their conclusion is like, bleh. All right, well, let's try a couple more. I told you this was gonna be a long one. What time is it? 9:05. All right, it's been about an hour. Okay, what does well-regulated really mean? The well-regulated militia, Pell Center, well, blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's look up something else. What did founding fathers say about well-regulated? I want their words. Oh, this is that one. This is that guy, Noah Schusterman. Absolute fool. If you haven't seen that video, I absolutely ripped apart. This is the stupidest. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't good arguments. Well, I don't think there are tons of great arguments against the Second Amendment, but you can at least make an educated argument against the Second Amendment. Like there's ways to do it. I'm not saying I would agree with them. I'm saying you can do it. This guy is a buffoon. Noah Schusterman. It was the very first one I did. This was the very first research video, and I got into this, and it was just an absolute crapshoot, and I just tore it apart. So if you're interested in that, I'll yeah, just go back to my first research video. Well-regulated militia, Baltimore Sun. Oh gosh. Okay, what did the founding fathers mean by well-regulated militia? Okay, now it's reserved for our subscribers. Mm-hmm. Da, 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 da. All right. Well, this looks pretty good. Constitution annotated analysis, interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. All right, let's do this and then end it. Here we go. All right. Historical surveys of the Second Amendment often trace its roots, at least in part, through the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Interesting. Which declare that subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defense suitable to their condition and as allowed by law. It's a terrible amendment. That provision grew out of friction over the English crowns because as allowed by law is like, who makes the laws? And then you don't have a Second Amendment, whatever their amendment was. Like you have gun rights up until it's as allowed by law, and then you don't have any rights anymore. That would suck. That provision grew out of friction over the English crown's efforts to use loyal militias to control and disarm dissidents and enhance the crown's standing army, among other things, prior to the glorious revolution that supplanted King James II in favor of William and Mary. The early American experience with militias and military authority would inform what would become the Second Amendment as well. In founding era, citizen militias drawn from the local community existed to provide for the common defense, and standing armies of professional soldiers were viewed by some with suspicion. The Declaration of Independence listed as grievances against King George III that he had affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power, and had kept among us in times of peace standing armies without. Okay, sorry. Sometimes I get reading, then I'm not even paying attention to what I'm saying. Okay, so in founding era America, citizen militias drawn from the local community existed to provide for the common defense. Yes, okay. And standing armies of professional soldiers were viewed by some with suspicion, just like the Redcoats. The Declaration of Independence listed as grievances against King George III that he had affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power, and had kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislators. Okay. Following the Revolutionary War, several states codified constitutional arms-bearing rights in context that echoed these concerns. For instance, Article 8, Note 13 of the Pennsylvania Declaration of Rights of 1776 read that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state, and as standing armies in the time of peace, are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up, and that the military should be kept under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. Similarly, as another example, Massachusetts Declaration of Rights from 1780 provided, the people have a right to keep and bear arms for the common defense, and as in time of peace, armies are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be maintained without the consent of the legislature. And the military power shall always be held in exact subordination to the civil authority and be governed by it. Okay, mistrust of standing armies like the one employed by the English crown to control the colonies and anti-federalist concerns with centralized military power colored the debate surrounding the ratification of the federal constitution and the need for a Bill of Rights. Provisions in the Constitution gave Congress power to establish and fund an army, as well as authority to organize armed discipline and call forth the militia in certain circumstances, while reserving to the states authority over appointment of militia officers and training. The motivation for these provisions appears to have been recognition of the danger of relying on inadequately trained soldiers as the primary means of providing for the common defense. However, despite structural limitations such as a 2-year limit on army appropriations and certain militia reservations to the states, fears remained during the ratification debates that these provisions of the Constitution gave too much power to the federal government and were dangerous to liberty. In the Federalist, James Madison argued that the state governments, with the people on their side, would be more than adequate to counterbalance a federally controlled regular army, even one fully equal to the resources of the country. In Madison's view, the advantage of being armed, together with the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed, forms a barrier against enterprises of ambition more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of. Nevertheless, several states considered or proposed to the first Congress constitutional amendments that would explicitly protect arms-bearing rights in various formulations. Nevertheless, several states considered or proposed to the first Congress constitutional amendments that would explicitly... Okay, tasked with digesting the many proposals for amendments made by the various state ratification conventions and stewarding them through the first federal Congress, James Madison produced an initial draft of the Second Amendment as follows. Okay, the very first draft of the Second Amendment. I didn't know this. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country, but no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. Interesting. So this makes it out to seem like the right of the people. So when it's reversed, right? When it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That makes it seem like the ending is predicated by the initial part, right? A well-regulated militia. This makes it sound like the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Additionally, the reason why is because a well-armed and well-regulated militia, being the best security of a free state, right? So it's just it like flips it around. So now there's people out there who'd be like, yeah, but they flipped it around, right? It's just interesting that this was the first draft. The committee of the House of Representatives that considered Madison's formulation altered the order of the clauses such that the militia clause now came first, with a new specification of the militia as composed of the body of the people, and made several other wording and punctuation changes. Debate in the House largely centered on the proposed. Okay, we're gonna have to end up getting into that debate because I think that's probably where that's where like the information lies, is the debate over. That would be interesting if they have that whole debate on record. That'd be sick. That'd be a super long one because I'm sure it's like chock full of like a really intense debates and really heavy wording. But debate in the House largely centered on the proposed amendment's religious objector clause, with Elbridge Gerry, for instance, arguing the clause would give the people in power the ability to declare who are those religiously scrupulous and prevent them from bearing arms. Gerry proposed that the provision be confined to persons belonging to a religious sect scrupulous of bearing arms, but his proposed addition was not accepted. Other proposals not accepted included striking out the entire clause, making it subject to paying an equivalent, which Roger Sherman found problematic given religious objectors would be equally scrupulous of getting substitutes or paying an equivalent, and adding after a well-regulated militia the phrase trained to arms, which Elbridge Gerry believed would make clear that it was the duty of the government to provide the reference security of a free state. As resolved by the House of Representatives of August 27, 1779, the version of the Second Amendment sent to the Senate remained similar to the version initially drafted by James Madison, with one of the largest changes being the reordering of the first two clauses. The provision at the time read, a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, being the best security of the free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but no one religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. The amendment would take what would become its final form in the Senate. Where the religious objector clause was finally removed and several other phrases were modified. For instance, the phrase referencing the militia as composed of the body of the people was struck, and the descriptor of the militia as best security of the state was modified to necessary to the security of a free state. Several other changes were proposed and rejected, including adding limitations on a standing army in time of peace and adding next to the words bear arms the phrase for the common defense. The final language of the Second Amendment was agreed to and transmitted to the states in late September 1789. Okay. For much of its early history, the Second Amendment went largely unscrutinized by the Supreme Court. The few 19th century cases implicating the Second Amendment established for a time that the amendment was a bar to federal but not state government action. And the court's only significant Second Amendment decision in the 20th century seemed to suggest that the right protected under the amendment was tied only to state militia use of certain types of firearms. In this relative vacuum, the lower federal courts and legal scholars disputed the meaning of the Second Amendment and how it applied, if at all, to an expanding universe of federal, state, and local laws governing the private possession and sale of firearms. These courts of appeals that considered the matter concluded that the Second Amendment protected collective right tied to militia or military use of firearms, while some courts and commentators maintained that the amendment enshrined an individual right to possess firearms outside the context of militia or military activity. In 2008, after a lengthy historical analysis, that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess firearms for historically lawful purposes, including self-defense in the home. The Hill majority also provides some guidance on the scope of the right, explaining that it is not unlimited, and that nothing in the opinion should be taken to cast doubt on longstanding prohibitions like laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools and government buildings, among other presumptively lawful regulations. I'll just end it with this. This is my own personal biased opinion. Okay. The Heller, DC versus Heller case, right? It was decided by a bunch of conservatives, right? a lot of left-leaning gun control advocating people would argue, yeah, it was, it was written by a bunch of, gun-toting conservatives, and if it had been decided by people on our side, then it would have come down differently. Okay. Kind of just thought about this. But do you think that the founding fathers, actually, let me just step back and make one more point. After DC versus Heller, there was in 2008, there was basically a 12-year battle, 14-year battle until New York v. Bruin for being able to carry your firearms outside the home for self-defense. There was a long, long debate. Okay. And many courts and many people argued over whether or not you were allowed to do that. Then the conservative Supreme Court came out again in New York v. Bruin and said, yes, you can, right? All of you, may issue states, you have to give these people their permits unless there's a reason not to. Now the states have figured out ways to work around that. So they give you the permit, but then they make it illegal to go elsewhere. And okay, so my point in saying this is every time there's a conservative court, they come down on the side of the Second Amendment in the way that gun-toting Americans are super pumped about, right? Do you think that the founding fathers were pro-gun control or pro-gun rights? Like, if you're being honest with yourself, like they carried guns all the time. Went over that in one of the other videos. They carried guns. They just fought a war. I don't know. I'm going to keep doing research, but like the more I think about this, the more it just makes sense to me that when you have people who just fought for their freedom, the thing that they are going to make sure that they can continue to pass down as a God-given right to the generations that follow is the right to bear arms. And to bear arms in a way that you can fight back against a tyrannical government and an out-of-control standing army. And if that's the case, then ARs, semi-automatic weapons, pistols, high-capacity magazines, which are just normal magazines. I would argue that a 100-round drum is a high-capacity magazine, but a 30-round magazine is not high capacity. It's just higher capacity than like a 10-round magazine, right? I would argue a 10-round magazine is a low-capacity magazine, right? A 30-round magazine is a normal capacity magazine. I would agree with you that a 100-round magazine or 100-round drum, because they don't make 100-round magazines, but a 100-round drum is a high-capacity magazine, right? It's high capacity, 100 rounds, that's a lot of rounds. But 10 rounds is not a lot of rounds. Like if you think about, if you go online and you look at self-defense situations, it is really common for people to shoot 10 rounds like that in a self-defense situation. It goes by like that. And so when you're talking about going into war and fighting back against a tyrannical government, I mean, 10 rounds is like pop, over, pop, over, pop. It's like, pop, 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 done. Like 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and you could do it even faster than that. It's like pop, 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 pop. Like if you're trying to like send rounds down range because you have to like cover somebody as they're moving. I'm getting like, now I'm getting tired and I'm all over the place. But the founding fathers would want us to be able to fight back against a tyrannical government. I don't know. After like reading this, and I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep like giving the other side their due. But I don't know, this other one. Where was it? I think I lost it. This one. I mean, they talk about like how they, you know, well-regulated militia, you know, like well-regulated didn't mean well-regulated as in regulated by the state. It just meant well-working, a good working militia, and they were scared of standing armies. Like, if you want a good working militia and you're scared of standing armies, what do you have to make sure that you do? You have to make sure that you have a fighting force completely outside the government. How do you do that? You have a militia, a well regulated, which by their own terms in here, it says well regulated, that the militia was prepared to do its duty. And I can tell you right now, and you can talk to anybody who knows anything about war, you are not prepared to do your duty and go to war if you have a 10-round magazine and a pistol. You're just not. So anyway, we'll leave it there. I think this is yeah, I think that's good. All right. Until next time, stay safe, live free, and I'll talk to you later. See ya.